Montana Territory, July 1883. The sun had just crested the peaks of the Absaroka Range when the knock came 3 sharp raps against the wooden door, fast and certain. Inside the small cabin tucked against the edge of the forest, Beatrice Calloway startled upright from where she had been bent over the hearth, tending a pan of oats. Her son, Silas, still half asleep, rubbed his eyes and blinked up at her from the cot. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. There he stood broad-shouldered, dust-covered, and holding his hat in one hand. His shirt was faded from sun and saddle, sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms strong and freckled. His horse waited behind him, reins looped loose over the porch rail. "Morning, Beatrice," he said, voice deep and even. "Hope I am not catching you too early." Beatrice blinked at him. Vincent Fairburn. The cowboy who had worked cattle for the last year on the ranch 3 miles up the ridge. He had come a few times with supplies, once helped her stack wood before the first snow, and another time had brought Silas a carved little bird he whittled from pine scrap. But not like this. Not this early. Not with something in his eyes that looked like purpose. "I was headed to the river," he said, glancing past her shoulder toward the boy. "Thought I might take Silas along, let you rest a while." Beatrice hesitated. "You want to take my son fishing?" He nodded. "If it is all right with you." "He's been cooped up since the fever passed. Figured he could use some sun, and I figured maybe you could use a morning without worry." Her shoulders tensed, then slowly dropped. Weeks of tending to Silas through his sickness hung on her like wet cloth. Her hair was tied back in a messy knot, her hands cracked from washing and scrubbing. She had not slept more than a few hours at a time in a month, and Vincent he had never once asked for anything in return. Beatrice looked back at her son. Silas was already slipping on his boots, face lit up like Christmas morning. She turned back to Vincent. "You know how to keep a boy from falling in?" "I do," he said, smiling with just his eyes. She nodded once. "All right. But bring him back before noon." "I will." By the time Vincent lifted Silas up into the saddle and climbed up behind him, Beatrice was already standing on the porch, arms crossed, watching every move. She did not wave, but she did not close the door either, not until the horse had vanished down the trail. The river sat wide and slow beneath the cottonwoods, a silver ribbon winding through the valley. Vincent helped Silas down from the horse and handed him a rod he had brought, made from hickory and strung with line and a bent nail hook. "You ever fish before?" he asked. Silas shook his head. "Well," Vincent said, crouching beside him, "we will start simple. You see where the water gets darker over there? That is where the trout like to hide. You just drop your line in and wait." They sat together on the bank, Vincent's long legs stretched beside the boy's smaller ones. The sun warmed their backs. Silas kept sneaking glances at the cowboy beside him. "My mama said you helped clear the road last winter," Silas said after a while. "I did. She said you never ask for help, but you always give it." Vincent smiled faintly. "Your mama says a lot of fine things," Silas shrugged. "She is tired. She does not say much anymore." Vincent looked out at the water, then back toward the trail that curved behind the trees where the cabin sat out of sight. "I know," he said. "That is why we are here." Beatrice stood in the doorway longer than she meant to. The silence in the cabin was strange. Not bad, just still. She eased onto the rocking chair by the window, hands folded in her lap. Her muscles ached, but she did not move. Outside, birds chirped. The wind brushed through the grass. For the first time in weeks, her mind was not racing. She dozed. When she woke, the light had shifted. Noon was near. She stepped onto the porch just as Vincent rode back into view, Silas in front, shouting something about a fish this big with both arms flung wide. Vincent was laughing, one hand steady on the reins, the other resting gently on the boy's back. Beatrice felt her throat tighten. Silas jumped down and came running, waving a string of 2 small trout. "Mama, he showed me how." Beatrice crouched, hugged him tight. "I see that." Vincent dismounted and tied the horse to the post. "I hope it was all right," he said. Beatrice stood, brushing her skirt. "You brought him back." "In one piece and happy." Vincent met her eyes. "You look rested." "I am." He nodded, then took a step back. "Well, best not overstay." Beatrice hesitated. "Would you stay for supper? Trout's fresh." Vincent looked at her, then at Silas, then back at her. "If you are sure." I would not have asked if I was not, he smiled again. This time it touched his whole face. That night, after Silas had gone to bed, Vincent stayed to help clean up. Beatrice washed while he dried. Their hands brushed once at the basin, neither pulled away. You were good with him, she said quietly. I like him, Vincent said. He is a fine boy, strong like his mother. She turned to him, cloth still in her hand. You do not have to keep doing things for us, I know. Then why do you? He looked at her for a long moment, the lamplight soft on his face. Because I want to. She held his gaze, heart thudding. Then slowly she set the cloth down. Silas stirred in the next room, a soft mumble in sleep. Beatrice stepped back, suddenly unsure. It is late, Vincent nodded. I will see myself out. He reached for his hat, hesitated, then looked back at her. If you ever need rest again, he said, voice low, I will take him to the river. As many times as you need. Beatrice watched him walk out into the dark, the door closing soft behind him. She stood there a long time, her hand resting on the frame, and for the first time in years, her heart felt something like hope again. The next morning broke cloudy, the sort of dim gray that softened the ridgeline and made the grass seem greener than it was. Beatrice stood by the root cellar, apron tied tight, sorting through what potatoes hadn't gone soft in the heat. Her fingers were raw from scrubbing them clean, but she didn't stop until she had a good dozen set aside. She didn't hear the horse until it was close. The steady tread on packed dirt sent a ripple of heat through her chest before she turned to see him. Vincent dismounted slow, leading the gelding by the reins. His shirt was different, clean, tucked neatly, and his boots had been brushed. There was something careful in the way he approached, like he wasn't sure if he ought to. I brought flour, he said, holding up the sack. Beatrice wiped her hands on her skirt. I still have some left. I figured, thought you might want more before the next rain, roads'll go to mud. She stepped forward and took it from him, the weight of it grounding her. Thank you. He nodded once and looked past her shoulder toward the cabin. Silas around. He's helping chop kindling. I told him he could go with you again if you were planning on it. I was, Vincent said, quiet. Not unless you minded. She hesitated, then tilted her head. He said you told him about your brother. Vincent's gaze drifted to the trees. I did. Beatrice didn't press, just waited. He drowned, Vincent said finally. In a creek south of Ailing, I was supposed to be watching him. He was 6, her breath caught, but she didn't reach for him. I'm sorry. I don't say it for pity, he said, eyes back on hers. Just so you know, I don't take the river lightly. Beatrice set the flour down on the porch step. I didn't think you did, he nodded again, slow. I'll have him back before supper. He'd like that. Vincent turned to lead the horse toward the back, where Silas's voice echoed against the shed wall. Beatrice stood a moment longer, watching the place where he'd stood, then bent to gather the potatoes and carried them inside. That afternoon passed without sound but for the wind and the stove crackling. She kneaded dough without rush, set the table without looking at the clock. There was a calm in her she hadn't known she'd missed. By the time the light had softened to gold, she heard them returning. The boy's boots slapped the porch before she could reach the door. Mama, Silas called through it. He let me lead the horse. She opened it to find him breathless, cheeks flushed, hair wild with wind. Vincent stood behind him, one hand resting on the saddle horn, quiet as ever. He didn't drop the reins once, Vincent said. Beatrice met his eyes, something tugging deep in her chest. Come inside, she said. I made biscuits. They ate with the windows cracked open. Silas recounted every bend in the river, every fish they'd seen even if they hadn't caught them. Vincent listened, never interrupting, nodding now and again. He didn't eat much, but he stayed until the boy's energy flagged and his head drooped. Beatrice lifted Silas from the bench and carried him to the cot, brushing hair from his brow before turning back to the table. Vincent had stood, gathering plates without being asked. You don't have to, I want to, he said. They washed in silence. Her hand passed him the dishcloth, his moved with practiced ease. The air between them felt different now, not strained but full, like they were standing in the same current. When the last plate was shelved, she leaned back against the counter. You used to drift through here, she said. Didn't stay long. He folded the towel. Didn't have reason to. And now, his gaze didn't waver. Now I do. She didn't answer, but her lips parted slightly, something unreadable in her expression. Then she stepped back, poured what coffee was left, and handed him a cup. They sat on the porch, dusk pressing in around them. Vincent sipped slow, his elbows resting on his knees. "You mind if I ask about him?" he said. Beatrice didn't ask who he meant. "He was a trapper," she said after a pause. "Drank too much, but he had a good laugh. Died in the spring. Silas turned too. Fever took him fast." Vincent didn't look away, didn't fill the silence with anything hollow. "I stayed," she said. "Wasn't much choice. This place was his father's before him. I figured I could make it work." "You have," she looked down at her hands. "Some days better than others." A long pause passed between them, then Vincent set the cup down and stood. "I'll be by tomorrow," he said. "If you want more wood stacked, or anything else." Beatrice rose too, her hands brushing down her skirt. "You don't have to keep showing up." He tilted his head slightly. "Maybe not, but I will." She held his gaze, something in her softening just enough. "I'll see you then," she said. He touched the brim of his hat, turned and walked into the evening. She watched until the trees swallowed him and only the hush of night remained. Inside, her heart felt steadier than it had in years. By the second week of August, the wind came cooler in the mornings, stirring the tall grass and rustling through the cottonwoods like a whisper of change. Beatrice had taken to waking earlier, not out of necessity, but because she could. The weight of worry that had once pressed her to the edge of every day felt lighter now, shifted by something steady and quiet she hadn't expected. Vincent came when he said he would, never late, never with fanfare. One morning, it was to patch the henhouse roof after a storm had torn 2 shingles loose. Another, he brought beeswax and linseed oil to mend the table's dry cracks. He never lingered unless asked, but he never left without Silas running to see him off either. That morning she found him by the east fence, sleeves rolled and hammer in hand. The rails had sagged from age, and he was replacing them with newer pine lengths he'd cut himself. She leaned on the gate, arms crossed, watching the slow rhythm of his work. "You always this quiet when you're working?" she asked. He looked up, wiping his brow with the back of his wrist. "Only when I'm not sure what to say. You don't strike me as someone who talks just to fill the air." He gave a half shrug. "Talking's easy. Saying something worth hearing's harder." She stepped through the gate and picked up one of the loose boards. "You mind if I help?" "I'd be glad for it." They worked side by side, the smell of fresh cut wood and sun-warmed earth rising between them. She held the boards steady while he nailed them, both moving in a quiet rhythm that didn't need words. When they reached the final post, he glanced her way. "You ever think about selling this place?" Beatrice stilled, her hands resting on the last board. "Not seriously, why?" Just wondered. "Land like this, folks would pay for it. Could move closer to town, be easier." She looked out toward the trees where the river lay hidden beyond the rise. "Easy's never been the point," she said. "This land's the only thing that's stayed put." He nodded, gaze following hers. "I understand that." She turned to him. "You ever stay anywhere longer than a season?" He hesitated. "No, never had reason to." "Do you now?" He met her eyes fully for the first time that morning. "I think I might." They didn't speak after that, not while they packed the tools or walked back toward the house. But something had shifted, something unspoken, yet solid as the new fence behind them. That evening, Silas was sprawled on the floor, carving a stick into a crooked arrow. Beatrice sat by the window, stitching a hem that had come loose on one of his shirts. Vincent stood near the stove, hands in his pockets, watching the boy work. "He's careful," Vincent said. "Takes his time." "He's always been like that," Beatrice replied. Even as a baby, he'd watch before he reached for anything. Vincent lowered beside the boy, watching the slow drag of the knife along the grain. "What's it for?" "Not sure yet," Silas said. "Maybe a pointer, maybe just to see if I can make it smooth." "That's enough reason," Vincent said. When Silas finally climbed into bed, the house felt different still, but not lonely. Beatrice poured 2 cups of chicory and handed one to Vincent. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked after a few sips. He looked over the rim of the tin cup. "Often, and I've been wondering if I'd ask you a question, but I don't want to put you in a place where you feel cornered." She set her cup down slowly. "You wouldn't." He studied her face, open and unwavering. "I'd like to keep coming back," he said, "not just to help, to belong." "To both of you." Beatrice didn't answer right away. Her fingers rested lightly on the hem of her skirt, the firelight flickering across her cheek. "I don't need fixing, Vincent. I wouldn't try." And I won't be beholden to anyone again. I wouldn't ask that either. She stood then, slow and deliberate, and crossed to where he sat. Her hand found his, warm and firm. I don't know what this is yet, she said. But I do know the house feels better when you're in it. Vincent rose, fingers still curled around hers. That's enough for me to start with. They stood there in the hush, the fire crackling low, the boy breathing steady in the next room. No promises were spoken, but none were needed. The wind outside had settled. Inside, something had taken root. The morning after the first frost, Beatrice found herself standing by the clothesline, fingers stiff with cold as she pinned Silas's shirt to the rope. The sun hadn't yet cleared the hills, and the grass crunched underfoot. She hadn't expected him that day. Vincent usually waited until the afternoon, but she saw him through the trees before she heard the horse. He didn't ride up right away. Instead, he dismounted at the edge of the clearing and walked the rest of the way in, reins looped loosely in his hand. His coat was heavier than the one he'd worn before, collar turned up against the wind. When he reached her, he tipped his hat, then looked toward the cabin. "Smoke's light," he said. "You not lit the stove yet?" "I fed it at dawn," she replied. "It burns low this time of morning. You got enough wood for the cold stretch?" "I've enough for the week. After that, I'll need more." He didn't answer right away, just looked toward the stand of pines beyond the fence. "I came early because I wanted to ask something," he said, voice lower than usual, though not uncertain. Beatrice straightened from the line and met his eyes. "Go on." "There's a man I know down near Bozeman. Keeps a small herd, needs help through winter. Offered me regular work if I want it." Her stomach twisted, but she kept her face steady. "You thinking of taking it?" "I was," he said, "until I thought about what I'd be leaving." She let out a breath, slow and quiet. "You'd be gone long, 5 months. Maybe 6, depending on thaw. That's a long time for a boy to miss someone he's grown fond of." "I figured that too." Beatrice looked down at her hands, then at the shirt still in her basket. "If you're asking whether I'd wait for you, I would," she said. "But I'd rather not have to." Vincent didn't speak at first. Then he stepped closer, the earth soft under his boots. "I've lived out of saddlebags too long to pretend I'm made for staying in one place easily, but I've been thinking on what it means to be needed somewhere. To be wanted." Beatrice's hands dropped to her sides. "You think you're not already?" "I didn't know if I should say it plain. Say it now then. I want to build something, not just a roof or a fence. Something that lasts through the hard seasons." She felt her throat tighten, but her voice held. "I've only ever known how to hold things together after they've fallen apart," she said, "but I'd like to learn something steadier." He reached for her hand, warm despite the chill, and didn't let go. "What if I said I'd turn that job down, that I'd stay and help see this place through the winter?" "I'd say you'd better be ready for a lean larder and long nights," she said, eyes steady. "I've had worse. But never for something that mattered to me." A sound broke the stillness. Silas's boots on the porch, the door creaking as he stepped out, blanket still wrapped around his shoulders. "You're early," he called, grinning. Vincent turned, still holding Beatrice's hand. "Thought I'd help your mama with the chopping before the ground freezes." Silas nodded, then yawned. "I'll be out in a bit." The door closed again. Vincent looked back to her. "I'd like to stay for supper, if that's still welcome." Beatrice gave a small nod. "It's always welcome." He stepped back then, moving toward the shed where the axe leaned against the wall. She watched him go, her heart steady in a way it hadn't known before. The frost clung to the grass, but the sun was rising. And in the space between her and the man now splitting wood for her fire, something quiet and certain had begun to take root. The first snow came early that year, a quiet fall of white that softened the edges of the world. Beatrice stood in the doorway with a shawl over her shoulders, watching the flakes drift down through the still morning. The garden beds were already buried, and the fields beyond the tree line lay untouched and smooth as milk. Inside, Silas read aloud from the tattered Bible he kept near the hearth, his voice slow and careful. Vincent sat nearby, mending the strap on one of his saddle bags, his needle moving with quiet precision. The cabin, small as it was, held a fullness now, voices, warmth, the low hum of work being done without urgency. Beatrice stepped back in, closing the door behind her. "We'll need to bring in the last of the salt pork from the shed. Snow like this might stay." Vincent looked up. I'll get it. I'll come too, she said, reaching for her boots. They crossed to the shed without speaking, the snow rising soft around their ankles. Inside, the air was colder still, the floorboards dusted with frost. Vincent lifted the lid on the barrel and began wrapping the meat in cloth while Beatrice checked the jars on the shelves, pressing her fingers to the wax seals. Some of these might not hold through the deep cold, she said. We'll have to keep an eye. He handed her a bundle. We've got time now to watch close. No need to hurry anything. She turned the light from the open door catching in her hair. You always speak like you're certain of what comes next. I'm not, he said, but I know what I've chosen. She looked down at the bundle in her hands, then back up. You sure this is what you want, all of it, even when it gets lean? I've ridden through places where I wasn't wanted, Beatrice. I've eaten bitter bread and slept in barns meant for mules. None of those places held anything that kept me. He stepped closer, quiet and steady. This place does. You do? She didn't answer right away, but her hand reached for his, ungloved and cold. He held it gently, their fingers settling together like they'd always been meant to. When they returned to the cabin, Silas had fallen asleep curled on the rug, book still open beside him. Vincent knelt to lift the boy and carried him to the cot, pulling the quilt up to his chin without a word. Beatrice watched from the hearth, something soft and unreadable in her face. She moved to the table, clearing the last of the morning dishes, and when Vincent joined her, she didn't move away. I never imagined it would feel like this, she said quietly. Like what? Like I could stop holding everything so tight. He leaned against the table beside her. Maybe that's what building something means, not doing it alone. They didn't speak for a long time after that. The fire crackled low, and outside, the snow deepened. When night fully settled, Vincent didn't reach for his coat. Instead, he brought in more wood, fed the stove, and laid out a thick wool blanket beside the hearth. Beatrice didn't ask why he stayed. She only handed him a cup of warm cider and sat beside him, their knees touching, silence stretching between them like a thread pulled taut and sound. In the weeks that followed, the snow never fully melted. The world shrank to the space of their clearing, the cabin, the trees, the river hidden beneath its white coat. But there was rhythm now. Mornings spent tending what they had, afternoons carving or mending, evenings with stories shared low and slow over the fire. One day, while Silas was outside with the sled Vincent had built for him, Beatrice pulled a parcel from the shelf above the hearth. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a length of fabric the color of winter berries, soft and fine. I meant to sew it last year, she said, laying it across the table. But the time never came. Vincent ran his fingers over the cloth. What's it meant to be? A dress? For Sundays, maybe, or just when the light's long and I feel like something bright. You ought to have that, he said, sincere and quiet. She looked at him then, eyes steady. I was thinking I'd wear it the day I stand beside you. His breath caught, but he didn't hesitate. You'd say yes. I already have, she said. In every way that matters. They married the following month, just after the thaw began. The ground was still hard and the trees stood bare, but the sky stretched clear above them, and the river had begun to stir beneath its ice. A neighbor rode in with his wife to witness, and Silas grinned the whole way through, his boots too big and his face scrubbed clean. They said their vows by the fence Vincent had built, with snow still clinging to the posts. Beatrice wore the red dress, her hair braided down her back. Vincent had trimmed his beard and tied a clean cloth around his neck. They held hands, solemn and sure, and when the words were spoken, they kissed in front of the boy and the trees and the early wind that carried the season's edge. That night, the cabin was warm with more than fire. Vincent read aloud while Beatrice stitched, Silas drowsing between them. The quiet was no longer heavy, it was full. Spring came slow but certain. The garden took root again and the hens laid steady. Vincent split wood with Silas at his side, showing him the rhythm of the axe and the grain. Beatrice planted in rows, humming under her breath, sleeves rolled to the elbow. They grew into their days without rush, each one folding into the next like a page turned gently. And when the river ran full and the trees leafed out like they'd waited all winter to do so, Vincent stood with Beatrice beside the porch, her hand in his, the boy asleep inside. Everything I couldn't name before, he said, voice low, I found here. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Then let's keep it. and they did for every season that followed side by side in the quiet strength of what they'd built together.